In this episode, we're going to design the settings subpage. So let's see what that might look like. We're going to have a big panel which contains a form that will allow the user to update any aspects of the paparazzi. This form will be separated in 3 sections, and each of those sections will have a little description. Finally, underneath that setting panel, we'll have a danger zone panel, which will allow the user to delete the paparazzi altogether. Okay, so let's implement that. We'll have a div which will contain 2 panels. The first one will be called settings, and the second one will be called danger zone. And let's space them with a margin bottom of 8. Okay, let's create the first form section of our settings panel. So we'll create a div element for our form section, and inside we'll have 2 things. We'll have the description on the left and the actual inputs on the right. So a div for the description and a div for the inputs. Inside that description we'll have 2 things. We'll have a little title, so h1, and we'll have the actual description of that section. So we'll create a div for that. Okay, so I've prepared a note that contains all of the text of our form section. So let's open our parent note and we'll copy all of this. So the first one is called target and the description is all of this. So now if I go back to our web page and I save our changes, we can see our title and our description. Next, we will enter the fields for that form section. So for the target section, it's basically going to change the name and the URL of the paparazzi. So we'll use 2 base input components, one labeled name and another one labeled URL. And we'll make sure to give a margin button of 6 to all of our fields, so MB6. And also, because we have access to our paparazzi as a props, we can pre-fill those values with the current value of the paparazzi. So we'll write here and here the model paparazzi.name for the first one and URL for the second one. Okay, now let's style this. We'll make this div a flex container so that the description and the inputs can sit next to each other. And we'll make that one a flex 1 to tell it to take all of the space available. And now this is making things worse because we need to define a fixed width here. So we'll say W48 maybe. Yeah. And we'll use a right padding of 8 to separate the 2. Now let's improve the style of our title. We'll make it much smaller, so text excess, lighter, and bolder. And to make it stand out a bit more, we'll make it uppercase and tracking wide. And we'll give it a margin bottom of 1. And finally, let's reduce the font size of the description a little bit. Okay, so because we'll be using that 3 times, let's make it a base component. We'll copy all of that and create a new base form section.view component. Inside, we'll copy paste what we had before, and we'll try and make this a little bit more generic. So first of all, we'll use the area where we defined our input fields as a default slot. Then we'll make the target title a prop. So we'll say vText title and define this here as a props. And finally, for our description, we'll be using a named slot instead of a props because we might want to give it some HTML. So we'll remove all of that and use slot, which will be named description. Okay, now we can go back to our paparazzi show settings component and use our new base component. So base form section. We'll put our inputs inside there. We'll call it target. And for the description, we'll create a new template. For the description named slot, and that will contain that description. So now if I save this, we have exactly the same result, but using a base component. So let me remove what we had before here. Okay. Now let's move on to the second section. So we'll copy all of this and we'll call that one scheduler. And for the scheduler, the description is all of this. Okay, so let me remove those two fields and write to do for now. Let's see what we get. Okay, so that's not bad, but let's make sure we separate the form sections a bit better by giving it some margin and a bottom border. Okay, so the purpose of that scheduler section is to provide the user a friendly way to update the frequency of their paparazzi. So instead of just presenting them with an input field that has a cron expression, we will ask them to choose like the frequency, let's say monthly, annually, and then we'll ask them which day or which time they want the screenshot to be taken at. And obviously, if the user is comfortable with cron expression, we can let them update the cron expression directly. But ultimately, all of those ways to set up a new frequency will be translated to a cron. So let's say the user says, I want this to be taken every day at 10 PM. They select daily at 10 PM in 0 minutes, but our frontend will be passing that as a cron expression before sending it to the server. Okay, so as you can imagine, implementing this scheduler requires a little bit more work than just setting up a few input fields. So for that reason, I'll dedicate another episode of this module to implementing this. But for now, all we're going to do is prepare the component that we're going to use for that scheduler. So let's call it Paparazzi Scheduler. And that is going to vmodel the frequency of the paparazzi. Now we'll register it down here. And we'll create it in our components directory. So paparazzi scheduler.view is going to accept the vmodel props, so that is value, and because it's going to be a cron expression, it's going to be a string. And for now, within a div container, we're simply going to define an input field that can update the cron expression directly. And because we're already using vmodel on the paparazzi scheduler, we can't reuse vmodel for that value on base input, but what we can do is set up the value props and the input listener, which is exactly equivalent to setting up vmodel. Okay, so that's all we're going to do in the paparazzi scheduler for now, but in another episode we'll make that a little bit more human-friendly. Now let's go back to our paparazzi show settings component and design our last form section. So we'll copy all of that. And that one will be called camera. And we'll have this description. And for the content, the user will be able to update 3 things. The device that will be emulating when taking the screenshot. So if it's a screen or a mobile phone, and if it's a screen, then we'll be asking the user to enter a custom width and a custom height. We'll also be asking the user to enter any custom CSS that they want to be injected to the page before taking the screenshot. And finally, we'll ask them if they want to capture the full page when taking the screenshot. Okay, and before we do that, let's remember to add our margin here and our border bottom. And let's also give it a padding bottom of 6 because we don't have enough fields for now to fill that section. Okay, so back to the fields of our camera section, we'll start with the easy ones. So the custom CSS will simply be an input field. So we can simply say base input, and we'll call it custom CSS, and give it a margin bottom of 6. And this will be updating paparazzi.css. Next, for the capture full page, we'll use a checkbox. So I'm just going to duplicate this and make that input a checkbox. And we'll make sure that the checkbox has a label that says capture the full page. And this will be updating the full page attribute. Okay, now for the device, we'll be using a base select. We'll label that device. and give it a margin bottom of 6, and that will update paparazzi.device. But the question is, what option should we provide to that select field? So this is something that's a bit tricky because we don't have our API yet to rely on. And our API will be able to tell us what devices we support, for example, the iPhone X or the iPad mini. But at the moment, there's just no way we can know that. So I've done some research, and for taking the screenshot, we'll be using a package called BrowserShot by Spassy. And if we go onto their documentation, you can see that they have a link that shows all of the devices that they support. So for example, the BlackBerry Z30, or if I scroll way down, you can see the iPhone 4. So really, this is what we need at the moment. We need a list that provides all of the devices that we can support. So I've already done that before starting this episode, and I've created a new file on the utils directory called options. And that file contains all of the options that we're going to need in our select form in all of our UI. So you can see, for example, our frequency options here, yearly, monthly, etc., that we'll be using in our Paparazzi scheduler. We've also got some month options, some week options, day options, hour options, minute options, and finally device options, which is what we're needing right now. And because this is the first file that we've created in our utils directory, I've added an index.js file, which enables us to have an alias in our webpack config file, which means we can import any of these options as if it was coming from an utils library. So now if I go back to my Paparazzi show settings component, I can import right here our device options from the utils alias. And for that array to be available in our HTML template, we need to add it as a data property. So now I can go back to our base select form and add here options equals device options. So now if I save this, we can see that all of our devices are available. Okay, next we said that if the device is a screen, we'll ask the user to enter a width and a height. So down here we'll add a div that will only be displayed if paparazzi.device is equals to screen. And inside we'll have a base input component labeled width that will update paparazzi.width and another one for the height. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll make the widths and the heights on the same line, so one next to each other, but only when the screen reaches the small breakpoint. So that means this needs to be a flex container, which is going to be flex call by default, but when we reach the small breakpoint, it's going to be a flex row. And we'll make these two flex 1 so that they take exactly the same amount of space, and give them a horizontal padding of 2, which means we need to remove some horizontal margin in the container. So now widths and heights are next to each other, but if the screen is small enough, they will be underneath each other. And if I choose a device that's not screen, then they won't be displayed all together. Okay, let me remove that dummy text here. And before we move on to the danger zone, I'd like to improve the design of the base form section component a little bit. So let's go to our base form section base component. And the thing is, this looks really nice, I think, for larger screens and even, small-ish screens. But when we are on mobiles, I just don't think that we have enough space to be displaying this next to the input fields. And instead, it should just be on top of it. So similarly to what we did with the widths and heights fields, we can make the flex container a flex call by default, and when we reach the small breakpoint, a flex row. That also means that the description now needs to take all of the widths available, and when we reach the small breakpoint, then it will take a width of 48. And let's give it an even bigger fixed width for larger screens. Okay, one last thing is we need to provide more spacing between the description and the inputs, so we'll give a padding bottom of 4, And we'll make sure that the padding right is only provided when they are next to each other, so when they reach the small breakpoint. Okay, so now for mobiles and very small screens, we have everything in one column, but when the screen is big enough, we start having 2 columns, and when it's really large, then the width of the description is increased. Okay, so one thing that we must not forget is our update button, which will display on the right corner right here. So we'll go back to our Paparazzi show settings component, and right here we will create a new base button that will be primary, and we will call it update. And actually for small screens, we'll make sure that this button takes the full width. So we'll say W full, and when it's reaching the small breakpoint, we'll give it a width auto and a margin left of auto as well, so that it is placed on the right side of the panel. So now if I save this, the button is on the right side, but if the screen is small enough, then it will be a full width button. Okay, finally, let's move on to our danger zone right here. We'll create a new div for the little disclaimer message that we can find here. And underneath it, we'll add a danger button that says delete paparazzi. And let's add a margin bottom here of 8 to separate them. Now I'd like to do something similar to what we did in the previous episode, where when you click on delete paparazzi, it will remove the delete button and show a confirmation message instead. So this time, because we don't have to deal with multiple screenshots, all we need is a deleting boolean. So we'll add that right here. And we'll make that default to false. Now on the delete button, I can say only show this if we are not deleting. And when you click on it, then we are deleting. So deleting equals true. Now if we are deleting, then we're going to display a new div, the else. And that div is going to have 3 elements. One that says, are you sure ? And then 2 base buttons. The yes button will be a danger button, and the no button will simply deactivate the deleting mode. So we'll say deleting equals false. So now if I click on delete paparazzi, we can see, are you sure, yes or no? And if I click on no, then we're back to the deleting paparazzi button. Right, so let's align that are you sure confirmation message. So we'll make that div a flex container which uses items center, and we'll give the text and the yes button a margin right of 4. And finally, let's push all of this to the right by setting justify end. And we'll do the same for our button using class MLAuto. So now if I say no, we can see that the delete button is now on the right side. Okay, so that's everything for our settings subpage. The only thing that is left to do really is the Paparazzi scheduler, which we will be implementing in the next episode.